Now there are actually two different types of cameras that we can work with in After Effects. And this first one, if I go to my camera settings, is a one-node camera. That's what we've been using this whole time. But we also have the option to use a two-node camera. So let's talk about the difference between the two. First of all, a one-node camera, I'll just switch to my top-down view or my two-up view. One node means that there's just one point to be able to control this camera from. So where this X, Y, and Z handle is, that's the origin of the layer. You can kind of think of it like the anchor point of the layer. If I rotate the camera, it's around that point. The position coordinates are based on that point. No matter where I move it, that's where the numbers are going to update from in the transform controls for the camera. But if I change this to a two-node camera by coming up to Layer, Camera Settings, and change this to two-node, right away we see that there's a new option in our transform controls, the point of interest. So let me hit OK, and our camera overlay has changed a little bit. We now have this thing that looks like an anchor point with a line attached to the camera. This is the point of interest. So the first node is the camera and the second node is the point of interest. What this allows you to do is basically tell After Effects where your camera should be looking, independently of where the camera actually is. So let's say I want it to be looking at this sun right here. I could just click and drag the point of interest to that point, and my camera is now oriented towards it. The actual orientation and rotation values have not changed, but it is now pointing at that point of interest. And if I click and drag the camera around, you'll notice that no matter where I put it, it's always going to be looking at that sun, even if I wrap around the other side. It doesn't matter where I put my camera in my scene, it's always going to be pointed towards the point of interest. So in certain situations, this makes animating a camera much easier because I don't have to worry about the orientation of the camera to get the camera to look where I want it to. It can get a little weird though because you can still adjust the orientation. So if I point this up or down or turn it left or right, you can see that it's no longer pointed at the point of interest, but the camera is still kind of locked to that point of interest. It's just oriented away from it. Same thing goes for the rotation. If I were to rotate this left or right, up or down, those values are relative to the point of interest. So you can kind of think of it like if the camera was on a tripod, the tripod is still pointed at the point of interest, but maybe you rotated the top of the tripod that the camera was actually mounted to, so it's not looking at it anymore. Because of this, I almost never animate the orientation while using a two-node camera, as well as the X and Y rotation. The only one I would ever really do is the Z rotation, because that lets you bank the camera kind of like this, rolling it around. It's still going to be looking at whatever the point of interest is. You're just kind of giving it an angle, rotating the camera on that Z axis. And I realize that might seem like we're overcomplicating things by adding two different properties that we have to keep track of now in order to animate something. But in many situations, this is actually really helpful for locking the focus, and I don't mean the depth of field focus, but just the subject that the camera is looking at in one spot so that you can just easily animate the camera around it. It makes camera movements very flexible and can sometimes be much easier to animate than just a single node camera. Now let me reset the point of interest and the position. And I want to point out something with the camera tools. Now that we have a two-node camera, if I grab the Track XY camera tool, let's say that I had set the point of interest to that back sun there. I'll just move that real quick. On the Track XY tool, if I move this around, you can see that on this view, the point of interest is moving with it. So the Track XY moves both position and point of interest values. I'll undo just a couple times, and if I switch to my Track Z camera tool, you'll notice that the point of interest does not change. The only exception is if you go beyond where the point of interest actually is. So if the camera moves past that point of interest, watch what happens. Right there, it just shifts out forward, and it kind of just stays with the camera at a specific distance, no matter how far out you push it. So that's just a little weird behavior of the Track Z camera tool, but something you should be aware of. With that second node, the word Orbit camera tool makes a lot more sense because you're orbiting around that point of interest rather than just changing the direction of the camera the way that it behaves with a single node camera. So that's how that works. And with the unified camera tool, again, it's going to by default switch to the orbit tool. If you right click, it will track Z, and you just press C to cycle through the tools to get to the track X, Y. I'm going to reset these values one more time, and I want to show you one more thing that having a 2-node camera is really beneficial for. If I right click on this camera layer and go down to the camera menu, you can see that we have a few options. These 3 down here are what I want to focus on. The first one is link focus distance to point of interest. Second is link focus distance to layer, and then the third is set focus distance to layer. Let's start with that one. In order to get this to work and for us to be able to see it clearly, I'm going to back the camera up a little bit so we can clearly see that this sun right here is out of focus. I'm going to select that sun, and then I'm going to Command or Control click on the camera so both are selected, and then right click, go to that camera menu, and then say Set Focus Distance to Layer. As I did that, you can see that my focus distance indicator is now locked perfectly onto that layer, so I know that is 100% in focus. That's a really quick way to set your focus distance precisely to a layer. Now let's go back into that camera menu and take a look at link focus distance to point of interest. If I click on that, now, just like it sounds, my focus distance is always going to be wherever my point of interest is. And it's doing this through expressions. So if I open up my focus distance, you can see that After Effects added a whole bunch of expressions, but it was all automatic. I don't have to think about it at all. And now, wherever my point of interest is, you can see that my focus distance is staying with it. So I can move this around, and you can take a look in this view. The focus is always going to be wherever that point of interest is. Now I'll be honest, I don't really like this behavior because I can't adjust my focus distance off of that point of interest, and it's not very often that I always want my focus distance to be where my point of interest is. So let me undo that until I get back to my regular camera. There we go. And then we have a third option, which was link focus distance to layer. So instead of using one of these layers to link it to, I'm going to make a null object by coming up to Layer, New, Null Object, and I'm going to rename this Focus Distance, and I need to make sure to enable the 3D switch for that layer so that that null exists in this 3D space. With that selected, I'll shift click on the camera, right click, Camera, and now say Link Focus Distance to Layer. And now instead of being the point of interest that my focus distance is linked to, it's linked to this null. So I can move the null wherever I want, and I can also move my point of interest wherever I want, and they're independent. But I now have this layer that I can animate from place to place to control the focus of my camera. And this is extremely helpful when you're working with shallow depth of field and trying to give off some really nice cinematic rack focus animations. And it just simplifies the whole process. It allows you to animate that focus distance as if it were any other layer. So that's a really useful little feature of After Effects. And that's really the difference between the 1-node and 2-node cameras. Which one you want to use really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're not doing a lot of these cool, fly around moves, you might not need that point of interest, that second node that you can just have your camera be looking at. And if you're not using depth of field, then linking the focus distance to a null isn't going to be necessary, but it's always good to know your options so that you can choose the best option for your situation.